हेलो फ्रेंड्स, केजी क्लासेस में आपका स्वागत है। आज हम आपको मैथ्यू अर्नोल्ड के लॉन्ग आंसर के बारे में बताएंगे। क्वेश्चन फर्स्ट, राइट नोट ऑन अर्नोल्ड एज एन एसिस्ट। आंसर, मोस्ट ऑफ अर्नोल्ड्स प्रोज इज रिटन इन द फॉर्म ऑफ एसेस referring to him as an assist. Hugh Walker has observed in the English essay and assist in direct contrast to Ruskin. Matthew Arnold 1822 to 1888 tended to mold all his prose material into the form of essays. The letters in Friendship's Garland are essays. The lectures on translating Homer and the discourses in America are essays too. Yet Arnold as well as Ruskin was conscious of a mission and was throughout life a preacher. But Arnold's method was ironic. Frequently he confesses his own inferiority. He is humble before the young lions of the Daily Telegraph and kisses the rod when he is chastised for want of principles. Coherent, interdependent, subordinate and derivative, it is possible that the wielder of the rod was not altogether happy after the submission. Though Arnold was only 3 years younger than Ruskin, it was nearly 20 years after Ruskin that he became a force in the prose literature of the country. In the main, his verse belonged to the former and his prose to the latter part of his career. Except for preface to his poems, he published no prose until 1859, and it was not till the 60s that he became an active contributor to periodicals. The admirable essays of the first series of essays in criticism had all, except the preface and the paper on the literary influence of academies, appeared during the years 1863 and 1864. The lectures on translating Homer had preceded then in 1861. These essays and lectures made Arnold the most influential of contemporary literary critics and by the many dicta not strictly limited of literature, in no small measure molded the minds of the young men of the time. The study of Celtic literature followed, and then came culture and anarchy. The former, for good or for evil, has been the parents of a whole school of criticism. All these volumes were critical, and the criticism was mainly literary, but alongside of the literary criticism there ran a vein of social criticism, and culture and anarchy is described as an essay in social and political criticism. Friendship Garland, though more ironical, is of similar character. But before the latter, which make up Friendship's Garland, had been collected, Arnold criticism had taken yet another turn. St. Paul and Protestantism was the first of the volumes in which he took the character of critic of popular conception of religion, and it was followed by literature and dogma and God and the Bible. Mixed essays, Irish essays and discourses in America were the product of Arnold's later years, having a spirit of criticism. Arnold then is a critic in a triple sense: a critic of literature, a critic of society, a critic of religion. It is unnecessary here to do more than allude to his services in the sphere of literary criticism. His insistence on the imperative need of disinterestedness, the lesson of unurbanity, which he thought he examples as well as by precept. His condemnation of the spirit of provinciality, but it is desirable to note that there is much beside purely literary criticism in the literary essay, and that once and again they were witness to the fact that Arnold possessed in a rare degree the special qualities of the essayist. His picture in the essay on words of the speaker at a social science congress reading from a manuscript written within and without, and producing in the heart of the poor child of nature lamentation and mourning and woe, illustrates his manner. The delightful preface to the essays in criticism again and again reveals the man himself, the principle to try and approach truth from one side after another was his guide through life, and in all departments of his work he expounds it again many years after in the speech to the Eton Boys on the significance of eutrapelia and the varying estimation in which the word has been held. This is a touch of sadness in the confession that the world will soon be the Philistines. There is playful sarcasm in the shyness he boasts of amusing the honorable style of Professor Arnold. Sarcasm is all pervading. It is present even in the nobly eloquent apostrophe to Oxford. There are our young barbarians all at play, but it is perhaps the most good-natured sarcasm that ever was so effective. There is humor too in the consolation addressed to the travellers on the Woodford branch when they were agitated by a murder committed on a neighbouring railway. Myself a transcendentalist, as the Saturday Review knows, I escaped the infection, and day after day I used to ply my agitated fellow travellers with all the consolation which my transcendentalism would naturally suggest to me. I reminded them how Caesar refused to take precautions against assassinations because life was not worth having at the price of an ignoble solicitude for it. I reminded them how Caesar refused to take precautions against association because life was not worth having at the price of an ignoble solicitude for it. I reminded them what insignificant atoms we all are in the life of the world. Suppose the worst to happen, I said, addressing a partly jailer from Cheapside. Suppose even yourself to be the victim. We should miss you for a day or two on the Woodford branch, but the great modern movement would still go on. The gravel box of your villa would still be rolled. Dividend would still be paid at the bank. Omnibuses would still run. There would still be the old cross at the corner of Fenchurch Street. The essays on religious have lost part of their importance by lapse of time, though the objection which was taken against them by professional theologians has less weight than the objectors imagined. It is true that Arnold was no Hebraist, but then for the work attempted in St. Paul and Protestantism and in literature and dogma, a knowledge of Hebrew was of no great importance. It is even possible that such knowledge would have been a hindrance rather than a help. Arnold quoted with approval the Duke of Wellington saying that a certain person was too highly educated for his intellect, and feared that he himself, though he knew nothing but literature and only a portion of that, might have read too much to retain the perfect flexibility of mind which was indispensable. But however that maybe the popular mind as well as the professional mind has moved far within the last 40 years. In part, Arnold's essays have been built into the fabric of thought. In part, the questions he deals with have become obsolete. To a certain extent, the same is true of the essays in social criticism. But in the main, when we read these, we are impressed with the sense that the same problems are before us still. As we have already seen, that is true even if we go further back than Arnold to Carlyle. So when in Ike Convertimer in Gentes, Arnold insisted upon three things that were necessary: a reduction of those immense inequalities of condition and property amongst us, of which our land system is the base, a genuine municipal system, and public schools for the middle classes. He was speaking of difficulties which have still to be faced. Some progress have been made, but neither the municipal system nor the intermediate schools are perfect, and least of all is the land question solved. Adding a social content. The core of Arnold's social doctrine is in culture and anarchy. Every one of the essays it contains is significant and still worth studying, yet it seems hopelessly unpractical to preach culture as a cure for such evils as force themselves upon us in our slums. England is practical and crisis out for practical men, but Titus Arnold, what if rough and coarse action, ill calculated action without sufficient light is and has for a long time been our bane. With a quietly sarcastic touch, he pictures the result of such action in Poro Miam East Necessarium. If we are sometimes a little troubled by our multitude of poor men, yet we know the increase of manufactures and population to be such a salutary thing in itself, and our free trade policy begets such an admirable movement, casting fresh contrasts of industry and fresh poor men here. While we are thinking about our poor men there, that we are quite dazed and borne away, and more industrial movement is called for, and our social progress seems to become one triumphant and enjoyable course of what is sometimes called vulgarly outrunning the constable. This from a liberal in the days when the Manchester school was in its glory. Other sarcasm abound, for it was Arnold's way to point out unmistakably, though with all urbanity, the defects of the people he was addressing. When he went to America, one of the subjects he chose was number, or the majority and the remnant, and in treating it he pointed out to a people inordinately proud of their unprecedented growth in number and in material prosperity, that in the opinion of Plato the majority in Athens, and in the opinion of Esau the majority in Israel, had been unsound in culture and anarchy. He is addressing England and does not spare her. The dissidence of dissent and the Protestantism of the Protestant religion, preparing ourselves by the study of modern languages to fight the battle of life with the better in foreign hotels, the doing into British of the divine injection by E perfect in the sentence Sir Daniel Gooch's mother repeated to him every morning when he was a boy going to work. Ever remember, my dear Dan, that you should look forward to being some day manager of that concern. These are specimens of the sarcasm he flings at his fellow countrymen. It can hardly be denied that there was an age occasion for them. The gospel of getting on is still preached. A narrow and vulgar conception of what is practical still underlines popular conception of education. The descendants of dissent still flourishes and still produces, though in diminished measure, the fruit Arnold saw spring from it. I remember, he says in the preface of Culture and Anarchy, I remember a non-conformist manufacturer in a town of the Midland counties telling me that when he first came there some years ago, the place had no dissenters, but he had opened an independent chapel in it, and now church and dissent were petty, equally divided, with sharp contest between them. I said that this seemed a pity, cried he. Not at all, only think offensive zeal and activity which the calling called forth. Ah, but my dear friend, I answered, only think of all the nonsense which you know now hold quite firmly, which you would never have held if you had not been contradicting your adversary in it all these years. We no longer boast of our incomparable civilization. We admit that the evils to which Arnold pointed are real evils. Perhaps it might be worthwhile for the practical men who have achieved no such brilliant success after all to consider what the unpractical apostle of culture have to suggest by way of cure. In a sense, it is the divine injection by B.A. perfect done not into British but into Arnold's. It is the pursuit of perfection, and that is the pursuit of sweetness and light. It is the assertion of self in a sense, but not in any sense be pleased. The conception of freedom as a thing good in itself and distinguishable from license must be abandoned. The great thing is to find our best self and to seek the affirm nothing but that. But this is difficult. Perfection absolute may be an ideal, but certainly it can never be attained, and the best self is not altogether easy to be discovered, still less to be effectively affirmed. On the other hand, the creation of fresh poor men here, while we are thinking of our poor men, there has proved to be disastrously as easy. It has been the same ever since. The choice of Hercules pleasure dwells near at hand, and the way in smooth and easy, but the way of virtue is hard, and the gods have ordained sweet of the broad to the traveler. Evidently, Arnold had the endowment of an assist of the most intimate sort, and it is only the reason of his choice of theme necessitating a treatment in the man less intimate that he has to be placed in the outer ring. Question second, Keats as a poet is absolutely and enchantingly sensuous. The question with some people will be whether he is anything else. Discuss after Arnold. Answer C. Analysis. Keats was no doubt a richly gifted poet. He developed here sensuous elements in English poetry, color and music, and in this respect he may be compared with Coleridge, Tennyson and the pre-Raphaelite poets. Milton writes that poetry should be simple, sensuous and impassioned. Keats might have exaggerated the sensuous elements in poetry. What he should not have been seriously blamed for it as he is here. The point is the Keats' sensuousness sometimes comes a little near to sensuality. For example, when he expresses the wish for a life sensation rather than of thoughts, or when Haydn relates of him that he once covered his tongue and throat as far as he could reach with cayenne pepper in order to appreciate the delicious coldness of claret in all its glory. It is Keats' friends and admirers who have made him out to be nothing but a sensuous poet and a weakling. The fantastic Johnny Keats that Byron and reviewer have propagated. It is, however, a picture little corresponding to truth. Keats had greet his brother George protest. John was the very soul of manliness and courage, and as much like the Holy Ghost as Johnny Keats, Arnold fully demonstrates the instinct for character in Keats passing into his life and work. Keats, as Arnold points out, endeavored to enforce his practical sense of virtue, as in what he wrote to his friend Bailey in reference to a quarrel between Reynolds and Haydn. It is manifested again in what he wrote to his friend Charles Brown, upon whose kindness he used to draw. He promised to fag on as others do. He had strength of character, as amply shown in his indifference to the critics who fell foul of him in the Quarterly and the Blackboard. He writes, praise or blame has but a momentary effect on the man whose love of beauty in abstract makes him a severe critic of his own works. My own criticism has given me pain without comparisons, beyond what the Blackboard or the Quarterly could possibly inflict. Keats was not one to be snubbed out by an article, as Byron thinks, nor did he ever court the praise or favor of the public. He writes, I have not the slightest feeling of humanity towards the public or to anything in existence but the eternal being, the principles of beauty and the memory of great men. Keats was not unaware of the defect of his poetry and could soundly judge two other poets of Byron who misjudged him. He writes that he was a fine thing in the sphere of the worldly, theatrical and pantomimical. He has something in common with Milton, and of Milton he writes that he had an exquisite passion for poetical luxury, but devoted himself rather to ardor than the pleasure of song. He was conscious too of his being addicted to poetical luxury. He did not live long enough to turn off the pleasure of song to its ardors. Keats was a poet of great promise which was partly fulfilled, and sensuousness could not have been everything in him. He has affinities with Milton and Shakespeare, and that because of his rich concrete sensuousness, and if anything is unfortunate, it is that the weaknesses of his character have been exhibited and exploited by his friends and admirers, and of these reviewers have taken advantage in their purblind isolence. Arnold puts Keats in perspective by drawing out the stronger and sounder elements of his character. Question third. Arnold writes that Keats is with Shakespeare. Elaborate. Answer C. Analysis. Arnold first points out that Keats is far from the fantastic Johnny Keats, a weakling and sensuous, or rather sensual poet, an impression for which his reviewer and Byron are responsible. Keats has soundness of character which is more than once manifested in relation to his own conduct and in its comments on his contemporaries. Perhaps his sensuousness does not deserve to be blamed. There is sensuousness in Milton, in Shakespeare, and in Coleridge. Sensuousness means giving due importance to sense impression and making proper use of them in poetry. When Milton says that poetry should be simple, sensuous, and impassioned, he claims the proper and effective use of sense impression as materials for poetry. It means the development of the elements of color and music in poetry. Nothing is wrong with Keats' sensuousness. His developing the elements of color and music in poetry. It is his sensuality which is to blame. Arnold should have made this distinction. Arnold is certainly right when he says that Keats' yearning passion for the beautiful is not the passion of a sensuous or a sentimental poet. The mighty abstract idea of beauty in all things enthralled Keats, and it is an intellectual passion, and so he could say, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. He saw things in their beauty and he saw them in their truth, and then he said, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. It was no small thing for him to have perceived the necessary connection of beauty with truth and of both with joy. Keats had what Arnold described as the gift of natural magic. It means the perception of the beauty of the external world and the rendering of it in the magic of words, and gift he eminently shares with Shakespeare. His fascinating felicity of expression, his perfection of loveliness bring him close to Shakespeare, and it is again due to his sensuousness which we must distinguish from sensuality. Keats does not possess Shakespeare's faculty of moral interpretation, which he missed because he died young. He was a poet of unfulfilled promise, but he is one with Shakespeare in his gift of natural magic, in the rounded perfect of expression and happy phrasing. He anticipated the pre-Raphaelite poet, and we cannot underestimate his influence upon them. Thanks, best of luck.